And joining us now on the debate in Waltham, Massachusetts, Rozlyn Burns, senior scientist at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University. And with us here in studio, Margaret Somerville, ethicist at the McGill Center for Medicine, Ethics and Law. Ken Zucker, psychologist-in-chief at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. John Hoffman, writer of the Uncommon Sense column in today's Parent magazine. And Jamie Poisson, staff reporter at the Toronto Star, who wrote the first story on Storm. Look what you got done here. Is this all your fault?
I think it might be.
It might be.
Yeah.
Well, tell us, how'd you find out about this in the first place?
Well, actually, my editor had heard about what the family was doing. A friend of hers had come in contact with David Stalker, and we knew that he worked at Cityview Alternative School. It actually wasn't very hard to track them down because there are only 4 teachers at the school. So when I called, whoever answered the phone knew exactly who they were. And I spoke with Dave and told him what we wanted to do, that we wanted to write a profile about his family. He said that he needed to take it home and talk to Kathy and the kids. And he came back the next day and said that it was okay, that I could go to their house, spend some time with them.
And you did?
I did.
And did they, I mean, what was their suggestion to you as to why they were doing this?
Right. Well, I spent 2 days with them. And I think really it comes down to, at the center, their parenting philosophy, which is based in this notion that children can make meaningful choices for themselves. And so there are 2 other children. Keo is 2 and Jazz is 5. They're both boys. And as they were growing up, they had a difficult time with gender. Jazz gravitated to pink early on. He'd wear pink boas, he loved dresses, and the parents wanted to encourage him to do that. And when he would go out in the world, he would have a difficult time with it. Sometimes people would say, why are you doing that? Why are you wearing pink? Why are you acting like a girl? You're a boy. And so their experiences with their other 2 children really informed their choices around Storm. I think they got thinking and they thought, well, what if we could mitigate all this stuff around gender, all these millions of messages the kids are given early on. So they're trying that. And so they're trying just to stop it so that Storm will have a chance to express his or her gender however he or she sees fit.
Okay, Rozlyn Burns, let me go to you next. Do you think hiding a child's gender from the public is a good idea?
I think that, first of all, the parents understand the difference between sex and gender. So the child is either a boy or girl biologically. The gender piece is the part that's culturally determined. And really, I think that it's impossible to hide gender from a child. The messages are everywhere. No matter where you look, your messages about gender in books the kids read, on television, radio, everything. So I don't think you can really create a gender-free environment for a child to grow up in. So I think I understand where they're coming from, wanting to push aside or stretch out the boundaries that define gender, but I think that their way of going about that really flies in the face of what's possible.
Margaret, you wrote a piece about this that suggested that there are some potentially negative consequences that emerge from this, such as?
Well, I can't speak to the negative consequences because I'm not a child developmental expert by any means, but what I looked at was what was the ethics of the parents doing this. And the first thing in ethics that we'd ask is, are these parents imposing this gender-free zone on these children? So is it really the parents trying to achieve some goal of their own in this respect, even though I'm sure they personally believe that's best for the child?
And how would you answer that?
I don't know. I mean, one of the things we say in ethics is that good facts are essential for good ethics, and we simply don't have those facts. Or is it rather, and when I read the piece that Kathy Witterick wrote in the Ottawa Citizen... She's
the mum.
She's the mum, yeah. I got the impression that maybe certainly Jazz, the oldest boy at 5, was expressing these what we'd normally see as female gender tendencies, and she was trying to cope with it. So it really makes a difference ethically which of those 2 situations we're in. But certainly an experiment on the child raises big ethical questions.
Okay, what are the possible, Ken, let me try this with you, the possible positive consequences from a psychological point of view for what these parents are trying to do?
Well, the way I've been thinking about this story and the discourse that has surrounded it has to do with people thinking about how does identity form in general in children, and gender identity in particular.
What have you come up with?
Well, I think that gender identity, a child's sense of self as a boy or as a girl, is probably the largest psychological sex difference between males and females that we know of.
When did they start doing that?
Children probably have a rudimentary sense of self that they're boys or girls by around the age of 2.
So we got a little, child's what, Jamie, 4 months old now?
4 months.
4 months old.
Yeah.
So the child's got a bit of time before it starts to be aware of this kind of thing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that the complexity of this story is that most people fit into a binary gender system in all cultures, just like we're largely a two-sex species. But there are people who don't fit. And the question is, how does one deal with kids who don't fit well into the binary system?
Of course, we don't know whether this child fits or doesn't fit yet because the child's only 4 months old yet, right? That's fair to say. Okay, John, let me try this with you. The reaction to her story has been, I mean, it's unlike, well, it's rare. I haven't seen this kind of reaction to any story about parenting techniques. Well, I guess Amy Chua, the tiger mom thing, was also a huge thing, and this is a huge thing as well. Why are people reacting so, I think mostly negatively, but some positively as well?
Well, I'm partly surprised, partly not surprised. I've seen this kind of thing before. I kind of think people are very quick to judge and very quick to assume that they know what's going on. But I think there's something, when people take a strong stand in terms of parenting, I remember similar things happening back 20 or 25 years ago when some people mothers started to breastfeed their children to the age of 5 or 6. I think people are threatened by that. They're threatened by something that is different, seems different, and where someone's taking a strong stand, and there seems to be an implication, whether the people say it or not, that that what you're doing is wrong and what I'm doing is right. I'm not saying the parents are saying this. I'm saying that's how some people react, and I think that's why you get that visceral reaction. I mean, on one level, you know, the way I look at it, this is none of my business. This is, you know, if these parents are clearly abusing their child, or they are, well, even then it's not my business, somebody else's business. But I don't like to sort of dissect an individual family where I don't know all the particulars of what's going on, because everything that parents do happens within a context. And to me, the context, how the child is loved, how all the child's needs are met.
Okay, no, I get that. But Margaret did raise this issue of, you know, if it's abuse, there's not much of a debate here. We don't know if this is abuse, do we?
Well, that's the problem. How do we characterize what is being done? But you know, the other thing is, it's not just the child finding its own internal gender. It's also the fact that with Storm, they're preventing anybody from reacting to the child as a boy or a girl, because even its grandparents don't know whether it's a boy or a girl. So to what extent are we depriving that child of the normal stimuli that a child would get that would help it to form its gender? So there is an interference, a very serious interference by the parents.
Can I just follow up with you on that, Jamie? Who knows the gender of the child?
Right. So 7 people in total. Jazz and Keo, the 2 boys.
The 2 older brothers.
Yep. The parents.
The 2 parents,
obviously.
that's 4. Yeah.
The midwives, 2 midwives who helped birth the baby on New Year's Day.
So that's 6.
At home, and a very close friend of the family.
A close friend.
You know, I think this idea of making a choice to interfere, I think if you asked Kathy and David that question, their response is that telling people the sex of a child is almost making more of a choice, because then you're shoving the child into a gender binary. All of a sudden, the parade of pink, the barrage of blue. So the way that they see this, from what I gather from speaking with them, is that they're providing their child with more options.
Do all the people who know, have they been all sworn to secrecy on this?
No, in the midwives, obviously, I'm sure it's neither here nor there. They're just doing their job. And the family friend is quite supportive. I've spoken with her. And Jazz and Keo, there have been some questions, some criticisms, that this is a lot to put on the shoulders of 2 little boys. If you ask Jazz, he'll say he doesn't think it's a secret. He just calls the baby Storm.
But does Jazz know?
Jazz knows.
Jazz knows.
Yeah,
and
but he doesn't use pronouns like
he or she.
he or she. They've started calling the baby she, but they envision the S in brackets.
So it covers everything.
Yeah.
Got it.
Jamie, in the story that Kathy Whitterick wrote,
Yes.
and I was surprised by this, she said that it was Jazz who suggested the idea that they keep these.
Do you know what? I got this. This is
Yeah.
right, Margaret. Let me bring this up. Michael, I'm pulling a bit of an audible here. We're going to the second last page of questions because we do have this excerpt which speaks to this very thing. Here's Kathy Whitterick in your newspaper, the Toronto Star, on the 28th of May. She wrote, when Storm was near arrival, Jazz, the oldest brother, was listening to Free to Be You and Me on repeat. It was a gift from a friend. He wondered, Jazz did, if people would respond differently if they didn't know the baby's sex. What gifts would they bring? If Storm was a boy, would he be allowed to wear dresses? Pink. There are these moments as a parent when you wish your child could bring a different issue to the table, but there it is, plop. And if you really mean what you say about being kind, honoring difference, having an open mind and placing limits thoughtfully where they help children develop competencies and be safe, then you better walk the talk. We agreed to keep the sex of our new baby private. It is true that an infant at 4 or 5 months is still learning to recognize themselves, to look in the mirror and think, hey, that's me, and is not ready developmentally to find a place in a gender binary. It is true and demonstrated in research and in the day-to-day world that strict gender stereotyping causes suffering to both men and women. So surely, we thought, people would understand our 5-year-old's curiosity about why people need to know the baby's sex. The events of last week suggest otherwise. Now, Roslyn, let me try this with you. If it was, in fact, almost the suggestion of Jazz, the 5-year-old, that they try this, what do you think of that idea?
That it was his idea?
Yeah.
Well,
what do you think of
kids
allowing
have a
sort
lot
of
ideas.
the 5-year-old to have what appears to be a fairly significant role in the decision around how to parent this child? How advisable is that?
Well, I think it's an opening for discussion with the child rather than having the child be the decision maker. And I think it's also interesting that with all this attention to gender in this family, that they're making more of a fuss about it and creating perhaps more emphasis on, what is it and who is it than it would be in the case if they had allowed this to be have a normal experience and stretch the boundaries. So if you have a girl and everyone wants to buy pink, you can just tell people that purple's your favorite color, or not to do that. I think there's ways to handle it beyond way within a more understandable range than what they're trying to do. I think that's kids need the primary category kids have in early development is gender. They categorize the world that way, partly because that's the way the world is characterized for them. But it's a major organizing construct. If you take that out or try to distort it, it's not clear how children are going to relate to him or her, or vice versa. It's very disorienting not to have that marker, because that is the way kids operate initially in the world.
So, John, that would suggest that what the parents are doing is a negative thing. Are you there?
No, I'm not prepared to say that. I don't know enough about it. I will say I'm not as like what I picked up in what you read was a really high level of concern about strict, the word strict gender stereotypes. I'm a parent. I've got 3 boys between the ages of 18 and 26. That's not the way I experienced the world. But when my kids were little, people were I understand the concern. I'm just not as concerned about it. But back then, there were people that thought, and it goes back to the Free to Be You and Me. Let's give boys pink things and dolls, and we'll give girls trucks. And we'll solve the problem. And it didn't solve the problem. And in fact, I've heard of a study where they gave some kind of ape, and they gave them a choice of the female apes and the male apes, the juveniles. They gave them a choice of trucks and dolls. And guess what? The female apes tended to gravitate towards the trucks, and the males tended to gravitate. Sorry.
Got to be the other way
Other way
around.
around. The females gravitate towards the dolls and the males to the trucks. So people say it's completely socially constructed. I think it's largely socially constructed, but I don't think it's completely socially constructed.
Jamie, I don't want to infer too much from the comments that Kathy wrote to the newspaper, but it sounds like the idea to do this came from a 5-year-old. In which, is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, that's what she wrote. I think that in the end, that's a question that only she and Jazz can answer. I'm sure as a family, they discussed it, and it's hard to tell, where those ideas come from. But I think that the decision, in large part, came from Jazz's experiences in the world where people judged him, gave him a hard time because of the choices that he made around gender.
Ethically speaking, do you have any problems with a 5-year-old seemingly mapping out a parenting strategy for a newborn?
Well, if you put it like that, of course, yes, you'd be concerned about it. But, you know, when I wrote the piece I wrote, and Kathy Witterick actually, I believe, responded to the piece I wrote in writing this piece, it really did give a somewhat different impression. The impression I got from the piece she wrote was that she was a mother trying to cope with the situation with Jazz, the 5-year-old, and that she said she didn't want to use her energy trying to deal with his choices, and she wanted to use that energy for what she called more important boundaries that she needed to enforce. And so that gave me a different impression of what she was doing. You know, again, ethically, it's one thing to sort of say, let's do an experiment on our kid and won't this be fun and we'll be famous because we've done it. It's quite another thing to be facing a real life situation and saying, how can we best cope with this? And whether she's best coping with it that way, I would argue that she's not. I would also raise a lot of questions about the fact that they agreed to all of this media and the publicity. I think huge ethical issues.
Let me pick up on that because, and Jamie, you help me with this at some point. There's no evidence that they are doing this because they want to be famous. Yeah. That's fair to say, right?
Completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I, Ken, let me try this with you. Where did I want to go here? The gender stereotyping thing happens the second the kid is born, right? Everybody starts asking, do I buy pink things or blue things for the kid? Do we have some understanding for, I think, progressive parents, I think that's fair to say, they come from that place on the political spectrum, who are trying to create a world in which we don't do that to children from the second they are born?
Well, I think the first wave that tried to uncouple gender expectations from biological sex started in the late 1960s. Non-sexist child rearing, androgynous child rearing. But I think in that era, people still wanted their child to feel good about being a boy or being a girl. I've done a lot of research over the years that certainly shows that children who differ from the norm in extreme ways are subject to a lot of peer social ostracism. And that's very painful, and certainly parents that I've worked with over the years have to wrestle with, how do I deal with my kid who is so different from other kids? And
but that's when the kid has already established the fact that he or she is different. That's not the case here. We don't know if this kid is going to be different. And actually, let me put that to Roslyn, if I can, at Brandeis University. Do you have some understanding or sympathy for a couple of parents who are trying to avoid the kind of typical gender stereotyping that we, you know, consciously or unconsciously, sometimes with harmful effects, do in our society?
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of sympathy for their plight. And we did a lot of research for the book I have coming out now called The Truth About Girls and Boys about this issue. But I think the ways parents have of managing that dilemma really vary. There's some constructive things they can do, and one of them is for themselves to be aware when they start to act, often inadvertently, toward their children as if they're stereotyped boys and girls. One of the things we know is that the notion that they're girls and they're all one kind of thing and they're boys and they're another kind of thing is completely not reflected in the literature, which shows that in any trait that's supposedly gendered, there's enormous variation. So that if you talk about aggression, for example, in boys, there's some boys who are very aggressive and there's some boys who are not all aggressive. And the same with girls. There are a lot of girls who are very aggressive and some that are not very aggressive. So any of these stereotypical traits really are, there's a normal distribution and there's enormous overlap. So when you have your child, you can treat that child as an individual boy or girl, but not predetermine or prejudge them with respect to any of these characteristics that are so highly stereotyped, giving them a lot of leeway so you can raise a daughter and encourage her to be, if she is an aggressive, athletic child, encourage her to be that, knowing that that's perfectly fine, and girls are along that spectrum from very little to a great deal. I think there's a much more flexibility in how you rear children when you understand that girls are not cut out of a simple, cookie cutter mold, and boys another one, that in fact the overlap is much more pronounced, and that within gender variability is striking. So you have 3 boys in your family or 2 boys, they may be so far different that you quickly get yourself away from the idea that boys are one kind of thing and very different.
No, that's fair enough. I get that. But Jamie, tell me, how are these parents, again, with the boys you're buying them trucks, with the girls you're buying them dolls, so what are they doing in the case of Storm?
Right. Well, I think the idea is that Storm will be able to choose whatever he or she wants to play with. In their house right now, for instance, the children are unschooled, which is a subset of homeschooling where children are encouraged to choose their own criteria. So if you love worms, all learning would be based around worms. So, for instance, Jazz has a caterpillar house where he's watching caterpillars turn into butterflies. Keo has a pink and purple tricycle, because he loves to play on his tricycle. So these are choices that they make. If they go to the library, if they go to the secondhand store, they sort of choose the toys and the things that they want to play with. I think that is what they're hoping to do with Storm.
You don't know Storm's gender identity, eh?
I don't.
You don't?
No.
And you weren't tempted to peek inside the diaper?
I thought that would really take away from the article. But the photographer, Steve Russell, who took beautiful pictures of the family, when we came out of the house, I guess it's besides the point, but 1, 2, 3, go, and we both said different things. So
you both took a guess?
Yeah.
And you both said the opposite thing? Interesting, okay. Let me try this. How essential, Margaret, do you believe gender is to identity?
Ooh, that's again, Steve, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that, but I think for most of us and most people in the world, gender is pretty important to each of our identities. And the sort of things that I'm interested in are, for instance, with the new epigenetics, which is a whole field where we know that certain genes have to be activated by environmental triggers, some of which will be dependent on whether you see a kid as a boy or a girl, because it's true, they're treated differently. Well, how are these kids going to fare in that regard? Are they going to end up, without the necessary triggers that one would normally think that they should have? Also, I think the other thing is that, where we've looked at children who don't have a mother and a father and they live with the mother and father and they bring them up, what we find with those kids, they find their major identity problems seem to be when they're young adults more than when they're children or when they're, just young teenagers. So, but again, I'm not an expert in this area. We should ask our psychiatrist about that.
I'm going to do the follow-up to Ken. How about the importance of gender to a child's psychological development? How important is it?
Well, as I said earlier, I think gender identity is a core aspect of most people's sense of self. And I think it's universal, and I think it's a very strong psychological sex difference. There are cultures who we know, in a sense, create third gender categories for people who don't fit the binary. And we're learning a lot more about people who don't fit.
Okay, but I guess what I'm trying to find out is, at what point does this child have to start picking up on the typical cues that a society would give to him or her in order to help psychologically develop appropriately?
Well, I don't know if I would use the word appropriately. One could say typically, but there are actually some really interesting studies showing that even babies under the age of 12 months are able to discriminate perceptual cues around gender, clothing, hairstyle, voice. And humans are seekers of information. We like to categorize our worlds to make sense of it. And gender is probably one of the most salient categories that kids use. As Dr. Barnett said, we do live in a two-gender culture by and large. It would be very hard to mask all of those cues.
Let me follow up with Dr. Barnett on this then. We know that, there's XX and there's XY, mostly in society, overwhelmingly in society. But I want to know beyond that, What role do external forces play in determining gender? Not sex, but you made the distinction. Not sex, but gender. What role do external forces play?
They're enormous. I mean, we are cultural social animals, and we develop ourselves in the context of interactions with both face-to-face interactions. We have interactions with books and media and so forth. It's huge. You can't separate a person from their social environment. And in our social environment, it's highly gendered. And I think that you could argue about that, but it is what it is, and this is the world we live in. And again, you can build some flexibility, and I think there's a huge role for parents in inoculating their children against some of the more toxic messages that come through. For example, if you're the parent of a little girl, you can help that little girl to broaden her own definition of gender, so when someone approaches her and says, gee, you know, you're not behaving like a little girl, because she may be doing football or something, and then the little girl has enough sense and strength to say, well, that's what I am, and I am a girl, and this is what I do. Because a parent will have given her that ability to make those decisions and to affirm that in her relations to the world. So she can be less vulnerable to those kind of negative, you know, sort of constraining stereotypes. But I don't think you can escape them. I don't think it's possible, or nor do I think it's desirable. The only way to do that, I guess, would be to shut a child off, you know, not let them out of the house or create an insular environment, which I don't think would be completely problematic.
Margaret.
Yeah, I think you've made an important point, and that probably one of the distinctions we need to make is that a young girl says, I am a girl, but separates that from what it's appropriate for girls to do or not to do. And those are really two separate questions, and I think where we can sometimes get into trouble is when we put those together.
I want to add something. I think that what she said is right, that and I think a lot of parents are doing those things to avoid the toxic effects of gender stereotyping, and I think it's enormously successful a lot of the time. I'm meeting all kinds of, actually one of the things I'm proudest of about my 3 boys is that they all cook. And actually I picked up my son last night, and I was driving him somewhere, and he was taking food to his girlfriend, and which I think is a fabulous, I'm very proud of that. And
what do you infer from that?
What do I infer from that? I infer that he lived in a flexible household where mother and father did, I'm a guy and my wife is a woman for sure, but we did, you know, I did laundry and I hung out the clothes and I cooked and I changed their diapers, and there's a lot, I think what the kids see the parents do and how the parents act is a very powerful force.
Does that mean that you're in touch with your so-called feminine side and they are too? Is that how you would interpret that?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah? You would.
I think it's flexible.
But I think there's a huge difference. I mean, what we're talking about with Storm is that nobody knows what sex this baby is, and that is not something that's very usual. In fact, I don't know that I've ever heard of it before. Have you?
Sweden.
Yeah.
Yeah?
What's Sweden?
There was a story in Sweden about 2 or 3 years ago of parents who also were not announcing the sex of the baby, but...
How did it turn out?
Ask the journalist.
Jamie, go ahead.
We don't know because there's no follow-up. I followed up with the paper, and they're trying to do a follow-up, but I haven't heard back from them yet. But I think the difference between this story is that that family didn't put their real names out there. There were no pictures. And I don't think people could connect to it as much as they could, Kathy and David, because they were very open and honest. I think whether or not you agree with their choices, what I respect about them is that they're incredibly honest, and they're incredibly kind, and they're incredibly steadfast in their beliefs. You know, at the same time, like all mothers and fathers, they struggle with their decisions. But you know, I think they believe that this is what is right, and regardless of the backlash, they're willing to put their ideas out there.
Roslyn, oh, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, but Jamie, do they worry about what's going to be the outcome for this baby in the future? I mean, when that baby's 20, somebody will say, oh, that's the baby that everybody talked about what sex it was. I mean, that's what I meant when I said the publicity. I didn't mean they were seeking publicity, but the fact that this has happened, does that worry them?
I think so. I think that they didn't anticipate this kind of attention. Kathy was surprised that the picture was even on the front page of our newspaper, so considering so many people are talking about it, I think that it's really thrown them for a loop. It's something that they're thinking about, and I can say, having spoken to them a couple times over the last 2 weeks, that they're really thinking about what's best for their children.
So has your newspaper had a discussion of the ethics of what it's done?
Of what we've done?
Yeah.
By telling the story?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an ethical issue for us. As a journalist, you know, I think we told a very fair story.
But does it, just because it's fair, it doesn't make it ethical?
Well, it's a story, Margaret,
Yeah.
right? It is a story. It is utterly unique, in which case, I mean, that alone makes it a story, doesn't it?
I think it's our job. It's very hard as a journalist to be invited into people's lives, and you know, it's such a privilege. And then to tell their stories and to also try to get all sides of it and even shine a critical light on it. But I think, you know, as a journalist, that's a responsibility that we have to put those issues out into the public.
Well, just from an ethical
Yeah.
point of view, you'd have to ask the question, are you doing serious harm? And if you are, therefore, should you not have done this? I mean, you certainly have to answer that question,
Well,
even if you're a journalist.
No, I hear you, but I mean, and we did 5 minutes to go. We didn't want to get this into a debate about journalistic ethics here, but I guess the reality is it's the parent's decision whether to open the door to the media attention. Once the door has been opened, it's her responsibility to make sure that she does it with care, accuracy, and so on and so forth.
And
Isn't that fair?
In that respect, I took
Yes,
a lot of care to make sure that everything was right.
Yeah,
that I got
know
everything.
you did.
Yeah.
No, I'm not criticising that, but except to the extent that the subject of this story is a non-consenting baby, and therefore the ethics that govern that are different from the consenting adults.
Well, remember, she's the reporter. It was the editor who made the decision to go do this story and the paper's decision to publish it.
But
right?
I think as journalists, we write stories all the time about children that parents consent to, so it's a slippery slope, I guess.
Ken, help us on this. Is there I don't know if there are any studies that would indicate this, but there are always children, you know, there's that girl who fell down the well 20 years ago and now she's 20 years old and she's always going to be famous for being that kid who fell down the well, and America, you know, focused their attention on her for an entire weekend, and that's the legacy she's going to have to live with. It was not her choice to fall down the well. It was not her choice to be rescued on CNN, but that's the way it worked out. Are there any long-term consequences of being a famous baby 20 years down the road?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm wondering. I don't know. John?
The key is how it's handled. What happens with Storm now? Now that it's out in the open and there's been a media storm, you know, whether the parents intended it or not, that's another factor they have to deal with. And what I hope they will do is attend to their baby's needs. And I think they would say, from what I can tell, that they did what they did because they thought they were attending to their baby's needs. And that's what parents are supposed to do. And I don't always agree with the way parents attend to their baby's needs, but that's neither here nor there. It's none of my business. But the situation will keep changing. This is not a fluid thing that's fixed in time, and there's going to be a lot of water under the bridge, so attend to the baby's needs and things may work out.
That does raise the question, Roslyn, whether or not, I mean, parenting, anybody who's been a parent knows, so much of it is one giant experiment. The textbooks can only take you so far. Do we cut these parents a bit of slack for trying to find out, you know, or trying to find a way that is potentially unique but works for them?
Well, I think that I just want to pick up one thing about a baby's needs. It's very hard to imagine that this baby has a need to keep its sex from itself. And I think that the range of options for parents is quite wide, I think, in terms of their behavior and within some sort of understandable limits. This is a new kind of thing, as you mentioned at the beginning. It's a unique situation. I think that, pick up what you said before, this is an ongoing experiment, but you don't have to wait 20 years to find the outcome. This is a child who is going to have to make decisions that most kids don't have to make. Do you go to the boys' room or the girls' room? What do you do when the teacher says boys on one side of the room and girls on the other?
Do they still do
that? What do you do when you go to the shoe store or the clothing store? For most kids, this is not an event, you know, for decision or a family crisis. You know, it's what kind of need does a child have to revisit this, or have this be an object of curiosity for this kid as it grows up?
I don't know, Jane. That doesn't sound like it's that complicated a thing. You go to a shoe store, you let the kid loose on the shoes, and he or she either picks the pretty ones or the
Well, take the
macho
Natalie
ones.
example.
Well, I know that Jazz picked, the first time he went to the shoe store, he picked a pair of pink running shoes with flowers on them, and his grandparents said, no problem, and off they went. So
I think the point that
But
John
that's not
made
as good an
about
example.
the needs of the child, if you put that first, then you're acting ethically. But I think the big question here, were the parents doing this for the child, or was the child actually doing it for them? Did they in some way want to test this out? Was
Well,
it primarily more for
if
them?
the parents are trying to avoid negative gender stereotyping that all kids have to deal with, isn't that a potential positive?
It is a potential positive, but the question is what they've done to achieve that within the range of what will not seriously harm the child? I mean, that's the question.
Okay, John, last 30 seconds, and I mean 30 seconds, John. Do all of us as parents place way too much emphasis on gender?
Yes. Well, no, not everybody. I know lots of people who don't. I mean, I think there are influences, and a lot of them are commercial. A lot of them are in the media. A lot of them are in marketing. I actually think people are doing a lot better on this. But yeah, I would say we place too much emphasis on gender. And where I would agree with these folks is I would want any kid, any boy or any girl to be able to, not necessarily to choose their gender, but to be able to choose their behavior, to choose the kind of person they want to be. And there are some problems that these parents are trying to respond to, and I see the same problems.
John, you got the last word today. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Rozlyn Burns at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University. Appreciate you being on the line from Waltham, Massachusetts. Margaret Somerville from the McGill Center, and John Hoffman from Today's Parent Magazine on the left-hand side of the table. Ken Zucker, psychologist-in-chief at CAMH. Jamie Poisson, we look forward to your writing a follow-up piece in a few years' time so we can find out a little bit more about this kid from the Toronto Star. Thanks so much, everybody.
thank you.